I want to touch once more again upon Leo. Because there's another thing that is common between the charts of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and it's that they both actually have the sign Leo. They have the planet of Mars in this sign. Now, to briefly backtrack to the previous video in which I mentioned Virgo and how Virgo is the sign that follows Leo and thus is where we learn how to eclipse the inherently self or sun solar oriented expression or way of being. I just want to note that in these two charts, when I look at them, because I understand Virgo to be this sign within which not only that we find how we are of service, but it's also, think about this, Virgos are notoriously known for being the ones that are cleaning things up. Literally, you know, that one friend that first gets up at a gathering to start washing the dishes, that's always a Virgo. Someone with a lot of Virgo planets, right? But and also Virgos are notoriously really, really attuned to the details. They're really analytical, they're really critical, because they're hyper attuned to all of these various parts and pieces as a way of understanding the greater whole. All of these qualities are embodied by Virgo. Now, in a natal chart, right, there are 12 houses, there are 12 signs. As someone who has looked at hundreds of charts before, as someone who has studied astrology for over 10 years now, it is much more common that in the natal chart of any given human, that we see collections of planetary energy in certain signs in certain houses, and other signs or other houses being completely empty. And all this means is that there isn't particularly a lot of energy in those areas or in that particular sign. I just want to point out that, as I stated in the previous video, for Kamala Harris, we see that there are 3 planets, significant ones at that, in the sign of Virgo. And in Donald Trump's chart, there is nothing happening in the sign of Virgo. Okay, so all of these themes that we're talking about, they are not being particularly highlighted through the person, through the vehicle of Donald Trump. As I said, I believe that Donald Trump has already fulfilled his purpose for us as a collective in terms of our evolution, and he was showing to us, reflecting for us, magnifying for us the shadow side of the Leonine archetype. Now let's talk about the light side of the Leonine archetype, and let's talk about how Mars in Leo, how this manifests differently in the charts of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris because of the fact that they fall into different houses. So now, think of the house as being the area of life. This is the where. This would be like the stage in a play. Think of the sign as being the flavor, or this would be like the costume. Okay, so now Mars is the actor. The planet is the actor. So now, what does that look like? Mars is the warrior. Mars is the commander. Mars is the pioneer. Mars is the daredevil. Mars is the Lothario. Mars is a very masculine and a younger masculine expression within us, in that I would argue that Saturn is the more mature masculine archetypal expression within any given human collective consciousness. Okay? So Mars is where we relate to this. It's our drive to move forward with excitement, with rapidity, okay, fastness, swiftness, if you will. It's where we find our fight. It's where we find our desire. So wearing the clothes, the costume of Leo, this is going to be inherently related to self-expression, to creativity, to generosity. This is going to be inherently related to really the key word is creativity, but and also Leo is, aside from the creator, Leo is related to the inner child. And Leo is also related to the king. And this is interesting. It's interesting because there's this idea of the divine child, like in the same way that so like an archetypal figure of Jesus Christ, for example, he has been called both the King of Men, but and also the baby Jesus is this quintessential representation of the divine child. Okay, that is that expression of both kingship and divine purity and innocence of the child as embodied by Jesus. This is an inherently leonine archetypal expression that we're speaking to. Now, again, through the shadow, this idea of the king can be grossly distorted, as we've seen in someone like Donald Trump. Why it's important to mention the inner child is because, again, if that inner child is not nourished, is not nurtured, is not encouraged, is not affirmed in their creative, individual, unique, special expression, in their gifts, this is what creates the distortion. So, Mars in Leo. Now, for Kamala Harris, this is in the 3rd house. The 3rd house is the house of communication. This is the house within which we're talking about how a person ideates, their style of communicating. This is important. This is important because something that I greatly admire and appreciate about someone like Kamala Harris is that, by my perception, she possesses the gift of what I call benediction. What I focus on is benediction. Benediction, bene, good, well, diction, spoken. Not just in terms of eloquence, like someone like Barack Obama, eloquent speaker, there is that quality, but benediction I see specifically as the act of speaking blessings. Speaking blessings. What do I see her doing in these various contexts within which I've watched her speak to other humans? She is affirming these other humans. She is point blank putting words to their specialness, their value. Okay? This is what we as a human collective need right now, because we are coming out of an age which, again, I would argue was set into motion, was created as a sort of evolutionary pattern. The baby boomer generation that had Pluto and Leo, that grew up with parents who did not affirm for them their inner uniqueness, their inner specialness. They then took that wound and they projected it outwards, and they either did not understand or know how to affirm the specialness and the uniqueness of their own children, and or they actively discouraged it. They stamped it out, they deadened it in the same way that it was deadened in them. And this is why we have these systems, these structures at play, which it's like it's this cookie cutter, this really boring one size fits all box. This is why we have a society within which artists and creative types are not valued unless they're playing the game. The game inherently creating a lot of utterly boring, utterly uninspiring, utterly unoriginal content. Cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste, all the same crap. I digress. Mars in the sign of Leo in the 3rd house of communication. This is the gift of benediction. This is putting words to the value. This is seeing the value and putting words to the value with heart. Leo is the heart. In the same way that the sun is at the center of the solar system, the heart, this is the center within our being. Okay, Leo rules the heart. When the Leonine archetype is in its light, we see this connection to the joy, to the warmth of the heart, fire. We are attuned to our own value, and we are thus seeking to reflect to others their value and to build this value, to affirm this value. This is embodied by this message of speaking to building people up rather than putting them down. Now, where do we find Mars in Leo in Donald Trump's chart? We find it in the 12th house. The 12th house is the last house in the zodiacal wheel. The 12th house is the house that is traditionally ruled by Pisces. While the 3rd house is an air house, the 12th house is a water house. Within the system of astrology, there are 12 houses, and 3 of those houses, there are 4 sets of 3 houses in the different elements. The 12th house and any of the water houses, but especially the 12th house, where we find planets there, they can be difficult to access because that inherently Piscean realm of the 12th house, it's as though one is looking through a fog, or rather the way in which the visual that comes through to me in connecting into Pisces, in connecting into the 12th house, and connecting into Neptune, it's like that of a mist over a sea at night. It's either that or it's the bottom of the ocean. It's literally the depth of the dark of the bottom of the ocean. This is a difficult to access energy. In that 12th house, and what I was speaking to the sign of Pisces and the Piscean era, and speaking to this idea of the martyr or the scapegoat of Jesus Christ, Pisces, the 12th house, this house is also known as that of self-undoing. Why? It's because those who are seeking to access the divine, that bliss state of the divine, which is the bliss state. When I say that, I don't mean like, what I mean when I say the bliss state of the divine is it's when we are so inherently tuned into our gift, our purpose. It's when we're in that flow state where we cease to be because the divine is moving through us and time ceases to be. Like literally 3 hours can go by, it can feel like 3 seconds. That is the divine bliss state. That is the experience of being the channel through which God, the divine, whatever you want to call it, the universe is streaming through us and into being in this plane. That is what we can access in the 12th house. However, when we find it difficult to connect to that for whatever reason, it then becomes the house of self-undoing, because we then seek destructive means to try to access that bliss state. So whether that's drugs, whether that's it's deceptive or distorted means of trying to access that divinity. That can also be self-aggrandizement. That can also be a perpetual mission to gain power. Mars is also a very power, a planet very oriented to, or very connected into our personal power. This could be the self-aggrandizement, which is attempting to embody divine power, to play God, literally to play God, to be God. By my perception, this is the way in which it is manifesting in a figure like Donald Trump. Not only that, but because the planet of Mars is the planet that is associated very much so with masculine energy, because it is in a realm, that 12th house, which is inherently difficult to access, I would argue as well that there is a corrective, what's the word that I'm looking for? Overcompensation. There we go. There's a corrective overcompensation that is at play. In other words, if that Mars is, in a sense, in that fog or at the bottom of the ocean, right? Difficult to access for whatever reason. Someone with that sort of connection to that energy is going to try to overcompensate for the way in which that feels difficult to access for whatever reason. With machismo, with acts of aggression, again, Mars in its shadow side. This is a very, very, very different Mars in Leo to the Mars in Leo that we find in the chart of Kamala Harris. Benediction has been a word that has been at the center of my meditations now for a while, but especially throughout this year. And again, we have the freedom to choose right now. We have the freedom to choose right now. To me, the choice is obvious. I'm choosing benediction. I'm choosing with my heart.